right, so let's just wait a few moments while people start to join us here for our webinar today. And I want to start off by welcoming everyone to a discussion about psychedelic ethics and risk reduction. This is a free live virtual panel put on by World Psychedelics Day and the International Psychedelics Awareness Foundation. I want to acknowledge first off that I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations in what is now referred to as Vancouver, British Columbia. The inaugural World Psychedelics Day, also known as 620, took place on June 20th, 2021, with many of the leading voices in psychedelics and participants from around the world taking part. Replays are still available. Just go to WPD620.org and register. We want to encourage you to participate this coming year on June 20th, 2022. If you're involved in psychedelics, whether you are an individual, part of an organization, or a business which promotes the therapeutic and life-enhancing potential of psychedelics, we would love for you to take part. We want to hear from traditional Indigenous voices, scientists, clinicians, authors, activists, and artists. All are welcome, and please join. If you would like to partner or collaborate with us for our 2022 event, please contact us at info@worldpsychedelicsday.org. So the International Psychedelics Awareness Foundation is a nonprofit organization welcoming collaborators and allies across all identities, spectrums, and geographies, and upholding the values of sustainability, accessibility, diversity, and inclusivity. Any funds raised from this event, which is offered for free to the public, will help offset the costs of production. So thank you for being here, because your participation and donations make it all possible. Please visit our website to get involved and list your World Psychedelics Day event on our event listing portal, which should be up soon. If you've got something coming up next summer, we want to encourage you to make it happen on June 20th. So we established 620 as the day that psychedelics are celebrated worldwide. So now I'd like to introduce our wonderful moderator for today's session. Paul-Marc Francois is a healer, teacher, and mentor for others on their spiritual journeys. As owner and operator of PMQ Spirit Works, Paul-Marc creates spaces for people to completely love and accept themselves without guilt or shame through self-discovery, self-acceptance, and self-care. Paul-Marc is also a psychodoula and integration coach and a well-known psychedelic pioneer on Clubhouse.
Thank you, Shannon. I first want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Comanche people. Welcome to our discussion about psychedelic ethics and risk reduction. I'm pleased to be your host for today's panel. First, I want to mention that we will be discussing topics that could bring up feelings and emotions. If needed, we have a list of support services on the WPD 620 website listed under harm reduction. There will also be a list of articles pertaining to topics that may be referenced in this discussion. It has come to light that there have been terrible transgressions of trust, sexual abuse, and other forms of exploitation in the psychedelic field, both in legal clinical trials and in underground practices. In a recently published open letter, many leading organizations and individuals working in psychedelics have called for the formation of an independent ethics council of professionals and to establish a formalized process for reporting adverse experiences. One of their goals is creating meaningful paths toward repair that center survivors at both the organizational level and within the field at large. All of this is in the context of the mainstreaming of psychedelics, with the potential of legalization through the medicalization route, or as many hope, through decriminalization of psychedelics and other psychoactive substances. How do we navigate these issues? How do we ensure safety for psychedelic assisted therapy patients? How do we protect others using psychedelics outside of that context? What about those working with unlicensed practitioners, guides, or in ceremony? To help answer these timely and important questions, we are joined by Danielle M. Herrera, who is a Bay Area psychotherapist providing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, working with ketamine and psychedelic integration at Sage Integrative Health. Danielle also works in harm reduction psychotherapy with Jennifer Fernandez and Associates. And we have Dr. Sandra Driesbach, who is an ethicist and psychedelic ethics specialist with a PhD in philosophy. She is an ethics advisor active in psychedelic integration, therapy, education, and advocacy, as well as a psychedelic facilitator and a professor at University of California, Santa Cruz. Thank you both for being here. There you are.
Having us. Here we are.
Hello.
Thank you, Paul Mark.
Hey, Dr. Sandra, how are you? Oh,
Fabulous.
we're talking about we're talking about reports of abuse in psychedelic assisted therapy in legal clinical trials and underground practices. Some might say that as long as the therapeutic profession has existed, there have been reports of sexual and other abuse. Is it somehow worse when psychedelics or psychoactive plant medicine is involved? Danielle?
Whew, starting with a hard question. Complicated one too, right? Because as soon as I hear that, I think, is it possible that any form of sexual abuse is worse than another, right? Because of course it's all just absolute horror and trauma that gets infiltrated into a body and then passed on from generations to generations. And yet still I hear the part where when we are considering the use of psychoactive substances, psychedelics and entheogens, what do we have to consider here? What makes it, I guess, worse, or at least, what's another way to put this? Just a place where we should really pay attention to is where these medicines have such profound potential to draw you into a place of all of those traumas being resurfaced. You are so vulnerable in those states, and it thus requires a facilitator who can really, really hold boundaries and lines in regards to ethics. It's absolutely a serious topic. I'm really glad that we're here talking about it today because it's just coming up more and more. And there's so much more to say about that, but I'm sure we'll get to it. So thanks for asking.
Thank you. Dr. Sandra, what do you think?
Do I get to write a dissertation on the topic? But I mean, and I really appreciate what Danielle was sharing, and it really is, hard, to want to be able to say that one way of, abuse is abuse, right? Regardless of where it occurs, and so there isn't sort of like, is it worse or is it better? But I think there is an extra sense of vulnerability and responsibility, similar to what Danielle's indicating, with psychedelic therapies and support and facilitation and sitting, including if you're just doing it by yourself, right? There's extra considerations. You have diffuse boundaries, and depending upon the plant medicine that you're working with or synthetic, it will shift what kind of vulnerabilities or extra considerations that you have. And I think we need to take it seriously, whether it's in psychedelic therapy or other therapies or indigenous practices or others, right? So thank you. And I'm excited for this conversation too.
And why are we seeing more reports now? Danielle?
One of my hopes in the fact that we are seeing more reports is that we are creating more opportunity for folks to feel like they can blow the whistle and say this wasn't okay. That's what I'm really hoping is happening, is that survivors are feeling that they can be supported by others in the psychedelic community to hold these abusers accountable. I don't necessarily know if it's that we're seeing more because there is more happening. There maybe likely are, and I'm hoping to like send many blessings to these folks who maybe did not have the chance or did not feel safe to bring their story to the light. Goal here is to continue to create spaces so that survivors can actually feel safe and know that they can talk about what happened to them. Gosh, this is going to be a tender topic.
I completely understand. You know, abuse is abuse. And when you're in that state, you can bring up even repressed memories.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Sandra, do you want to weigh in on that?
There's so much that can be said about, why, what's the reason. I don't think the abuse has increased or decreased necessarily. I think that Will Hall's article on Mad in America helped to open up the conversation again. Although the conversation has been coming up for years, as places like Symposia have been bringing up for many years and trying to highlight the issue. I think because it involved someone who is considered trusted in the space, that it became even more open for discussion and really taken even more seriously than I think it already was. And I love what Danielle was sharing about the idea that let's hope that it's because people feel more safe and supported in talking about it because Will talked about it, and ending the silence. That's literally what it was about. And I hope that this conversation helps to encourage survivors to continue talking about it, as well as people who are facilitating and supporting this space, especially as people and more people come into the space with more understanding and more awareness of the concerns. And for any survivors that are listening now, know that we are here and we're listening and we want to hear your stories. But there's psychedelicsurvivors.com. There are support available from peers, and I encourage you to reach out from whatever place that you can.
Thank you so much for saying that. And please put that in the chat if we haven't already. And I do want to say that for some of us that are going outside of the country to experience these things, we're going into different cultures, and something as simple as eye contact can be an invitation to these people who don't understand that we are more approachable. And so I think it's important for us to be aware of who we are going to for the ceremony, not just in clinicals, but also in ceremony. And if you're going down to Southern America or something like that, where within a tribe, within that culture, eye contact is an invitation to a sexual advance. And so we have to be aware of those things too. Danielle, if someone is considering psychedelics for therapeutic or other reasons, what are some of the things that should be considered to ensure their safety and well-being?
That's a great question. Okay, where do I start? So I'm a psychedelic psychotherapist, and I work a lot with psychedelic integration. So I meet folks who have been all over in ceremony spaces, underground practitioners, above ground practitioners. I think there's a lot that we can do in this question with how to prepare and identify who is safe, or how to kind of like lead this process on this in a way that could maximize the benefits and consent processes. What I would encourage folks to do is when they're vetting to see who they want to work with, no matter which where they're working for, like if it's ceremonial, underground or above ground, you want to ask the practitioner a lot of questions, like a lot of questions. And this is, just to run through it, like what is their intake or preparation process? Like how are they encouraging the preparation process? Are they going through like kind of a psychodynamic history? Are they going through an intergenerational trauma, ancestral trauma history for you? Are they, if you're a BIPOC or queer, then you should be asking if they've ever worked with BIPOC or queer folks before. Also be asking about like if they've ever worked with their clients in regards to discrimination practices, right? Like, or if there's anything, if they have history of ensuring consent throughout the entire process. You want to ensure that the practitioner is going to be offering some degree of integration follow-up after sessions. And if it's not directly from them, that it's from somebody else in the community, some circles or resources, so that you're just not left out after such an intense psychedelic experience with nowhere to go. You also want to check in about the sourcing of the medicine, for example. Is it grown sustainably? Is it sourced sustainably and ethically? You want to really, really like, this is like the chance to move into empowerment here and to like make sure the process is yours. That's like a lot. And there's so many other things. Really a big part of this too is paying attention to your intuition. If it feels like it's too quick, that they're not like attentive to the subtle needs that you are naming and not hearing your goals, then you don't want to move forward. There's differences in working with above ground and underground practitioners. If you're working with somebody above ground, you do have like a licensing board that sort of keeps them accountable. And ideally they're signed into some sort of ethical agreement, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to not be harmed by these practitioners. So same thing with the underground, you want to like ensure that they have some sort of like agreement for how they move through working with this medicine ethically. I'm sure I'm missing some stuff in there, but I will keep adding to my answer. Thanks.
So do you have a question checklist, or have you published one of those?
It's a good idea. I should do that. Let's see. No, I don't at the moment. It's definitely something I bring up pretty conversationally, but maybe I'll make that resource so that WPD can have it available.
I actually work with Talkhole, and if you go to talkhole.com, there is a questionnaire there.
Nice.
Finding your facilitator.
Nice. Right. I know I think the Ancestor Project has some good stuff out there too, as well as in general, good amount of just like psychedelic community organizations can be great resources for how to ask.
Yes. And it's Talkhole, TAHKOLE.com.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Sandra, you work as a professional ethic advisor. Perhaps you might give us kind of a ethics 101 on what is informed consent?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's, in bioethics, it has a very kind of clinical sort of approach to what's informed consent. It has to do with, first of all, respecting individual autonomy, people's ability to make their own choices for themselves, and being self-governing, respecting that, not using your power to be coercive, or to create a sense of incapacity in the other individual, and respecting that. So the sense of autonomy and respecting autonomy. There's also in terms of being able to allow someone's autonomy, given that you're quote unquote the expert who's been given the authority / power in the situation. There's a real importance to provide an individual with both information, deliberation, as well as options. If you don't have those three elements, you're going to be compromising someone's ability to make their own decisions. So for instance, if you give them information about, let's say, the plant medicine they're taking, but it's in English only, or if they read it and they don't understand, you use language that is not accessible, then they will not be able to have that information, even if it's on a sheet of paper. You can think about someone going in for a COVID vaccination in that form that you get. In terms of deliberation, that means you give them time to consider and reflect upon what the information they're given and what is provided for them. And then the options, right? If there's no choice, then it's not really it's not really autonomous anymore. But knowing what the option, like for instance, the option of not proceeding, of not actually taking the plant medicine, of finding a different provider, of using a different plant medicine. You know, these sort of options sometimes aren't even given explicitly to people because the assumption is that already that they should be taking whatever it is that they're asking for, and that being explicitly presented. And I would also include, in terms of that information, transparency, that the provider is actually transparent about what their knowledge and experience is and is not. There are people in the space who tend to misrepresent what their experience is. I always like uplifting Anne Shulgin on this regard about, you know, people who've actually experienced the medicines and people who haven't. And I feel like that should be explicit. I also feel like any sort of biases towards particular medicines or non-medicines, or, you know, just trying to be transparent about what kind of services you do and don't provide. You know, like if you are not willing to provide integration services that Danielle brought up, that is really important and really critical, that you're just really there to help them with, like, let's say if you're at a ketamine clinic and you're just taking the ketamine treatment, we're just here to hook you up to the IV and then we're going to walk out of the room. You know, there should be a sense of like, okay, we should also, like, here are the options for integration, right? Providing those other options that are part of responsible use, but getting back to informed consent. So autonomy, deliberation, options, and all of that, that realize that it's not, you're giving up a part of your ability to make those choices and informed consent to someone else, to someone else to make, in a paternalistic sort of sense, that the facilitator or whomever is responsible for your well-being. And because you're even more vulnerable, not that it becomes even more important to have those considerations in there, not less.
And it's really important that for those facilitators that have not offered integration, there are separate integration coaches like myself that are available. So, you know, integration, preparation and integration are just as important as the journey itself.
Absolutely.
So for both of you, how can someone consent or revoke consent while in a psychedelic state?
Okay, great. I'll jump in here because I loved your answer so much, Sandra, that, you know, I'm thinking about the process of consent. So kind of taking this question of how can someone revoke consent when in a psychedelic state, that conversation should be happening so far before a medicine experience. So what I could do is just kind of tell you what, like, the way I work with this and what I like. The word slow down and molasses really comes up for me in the process, and how much we need to not rush this. And how much we need to hold the, really, this is going to be kind of complicated, but the like Jungian psychodynamic, like many roles that can be played out when in a psychedelic experience, and hold the fact that those roles can be replayed within the within the vulnerable, non-ordinary state of consciousness that happens with medicine. So taking us way back with preparation, and I love how you said, Balmark, that, you know, preparation and integration are just as important. I would say, honestly, even more so. As a harm reductionist, drug setting and your mindset and your setting are just like really like so informative to how your experience is going to be. So to get to what I kind of do, I have conversations about consent way early on. There's the informed consent that I have signed. I encourage my clients to read it line by line. And if they see absolutely anything in that consent form that does not feel right, then they talk to me about it. And that talk isn't under the hour that they have to pay for, right? They do that. I also have conversations with them surrounding every way in which I show up in the room. Is it going to be comfortable for me to be sitting angled directly at them? Is it going to be more comfortable for them to have access to like food and water in the room? Is it going to be more comfortable for them to, you know, like even the way that I like when they're in a medicine session, like, should I make eye contact with them? Do they want me to keep busy by like doodling or doing something else so it doesn't feel so spotlight? The conversation on touch is critical, which I think we'll get to a little bit later, but having really specific guidelines with your clients surrounding what touch may look like, and that it clearly never will be sexual in nature at any point, right? Naming that at any point. So if you start with something like touch, then you're telling them that, you know, in the same way that if you reach out a hand, and we've talked about this before, you reach out a hand and you want it to be held during your experience, and then you say, no, I don't want to do this anymore, you let go, then I let go, like no more. And there's no pressure. There's no need to, like, we don't need to talk about it, right? It's on your terms. So.
Dr. Sandra?
I really appreciate everything you shared, Danielle. And I want to add, I mean, in terms of like, well, you obviously have to have a conversation in advance, both about, you know, what is and is not allowed and what is not to be expected, or, you know, as well as what those options may be available to you during the experience. Since I realize, you know, Paul Mark, you're asking about what during a psychedelic journey you may be able to or not able to convey, and how you would possibly revoke that consent. I like to include not just a sort of verbal, you know, what could you verbally say or not say, but I feel it's also important to include nonverbal cues, or, you know, because you may not be as able to communicate, depending upon what the medicine is, or at least effectively a revocation of that consent. And obviously you should always err on the side of not engaging as a practitioner. But I think it's really important for people who are choosing individuals to look for that as an explicit conversation. And even if there is some touch that's permitted, for instance, like a touch on the shoulder or a touch on the hand, then that should be even not just discussed, but also physically demonstrated, so that people know, like, it'll be like this, right? And you can ask me for it like this, right? You know, and really act it out. Or if you need a nonverbal cue, or, you know, like, it's funny, I was listening to the Chacruna conversation about these issues, and I appreciate that we can maybe continue some of what they brought up, was the idea of the BDSM community actually contributing to this as a sort of, you know, a standard that could be looked to for consent modeling, that there's sort of hard boundaries and soft boundaries, right? That hard ones would be things that you absolutely are not going to cross at any point in time. And then soft boundaries that may or may not, you know, that is possible, but you should still be able to say no to, right? To refuse consent. And it's worth mentioning that I think that is, you know, something that could be looked at and could be not borrowed off of, but to be built off of. And I think the current way that at least therapeutic approaches are, they're not built for psychedelics. And whereas indigenous traditions and what's often called the underground communities often have greater knowledge and experience with these practices and with understanding these sort of boundaries and consent than therapists do. And it's not saying that therapists don't have some good practices, right? So I appreciate the question, and I think it's going to be something we're going to keep revisiting. And I'm not saying that anyone has it right, whether you're talking about regular traditional therapy where abuse does occur, or whether you're talking about, you know, going to a recreational event and abuse occurs, right? We all have to hold ourselves accountable and responsible, whether you're a facilitator, whether you're a person choosing to engage, and take on that responsibility. And just to finish this off, I really appreciate Kylia Taylor's contribution to this ethics conversation on her book, Ethics of Care. She really talks about this idea of inner ethics, and that the number one thing that could really help is for the providers to know themselves. And that's probably the best prevention, literally that idea of doing your work. And I think we all have to do our work in order to do this work responsibly.
Oh, that was great. It's so wonderful to hear that. And of course, Dr. Sandra, just beautiful. And Danielle, thank you. So as you said, we're going to talk about touching. And we have two questions that are kind of there. But the first one is, in a psychedelic experience, is touching a client ever appropriate?
Straightforward answer is yes, only if you've had that conversation with a client. And like I said earlier, it's been a long conversation. So I could name that in my psychedelic psychotherapy practice, I have held folks who are on the floor as they unfold and scream primally because of their incredible psychedelic experience. And I've also had sessions where we are like 6 feet apart, and like that's what's going to be most healing for them, right? And again, it's something that could be really healing if it's something that you consented to. And like Dr. Sandra said, what to really like slow down and talk about it as much as possible, to practice it, to really get detailed about this is what it's going to look like. I even do things like say like, okay, if my hand's on your shoulder, like, is this pressure okay? Like, I'm checking in, like, is this okay? I'm thinking of moving my hand down a little bit. Is that going to feel okay? You know, like really slowing down and reminding folks that they can stop at any time. So yes, I think it could be totally appropriate in therapy, but only if you really had that conversation. Never assume. You don't get to assume. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Sandra?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, and I may be more radical to some extent, because I feel that, you know, not just that you should be able to consent to it, but there are possibilities for, you know, other physical touch that's possible. You know, and the controversial part would be talking about like sex work. And I know that's not a comfortable conversation for a lot of people, and I appreciate that. But it's also worth noting that what's the reason why we're concerned about any sort of physical touch? It's because abuse has happened and continues to happen in the space. And if we cannot create safer spaces right now and really reduce the risk and maximize the benefits for these, you know, treatments and work together, then we should really think seriously about whether we can allow touch. Right now, even with regular therapy, there are abuses that occur even when there's an assumption that there shouldn't be touch. And when there are certifications, and when in theory there's supposed to be accountability. And I'm not saying that revocation of certification doesn't occur, but it can give a false sense of safety. Similarly, there can be a false sense of security in saying like, oh, this medicine person has the knowledge and I don't, and a total relinquishing of one's personal power, individuality, autonomy, and choices. Or even a manipulation of saying like, you know, I totally agree with Danielle, like you should be checking in on the touch, but sometimes that same exact action and wording can be used to push someone into a non-consensual touch. And there's an assumption like, well, I just felt that was the right thing to do at the time. That's what they needed, which if you look at some of the abuses that Martin Ball did, he really felt that, this may be triggering for some, that throwing up on people was what they needed, you know, and genital touch, and that it was important for their healing and therapy, right? So, and I don't think it's a slippery slope. I think there should be real checks on providers, not just in terms of accountability and creating better practices, but you know, like just basic screening. One of the things that was brought up in the Chacruna conversation was, and I think it was by Kailia, I could be mistaken, about the percentage of people who have the sort of profile of a psychopath. And it's not saying that. I think for the most part, it is a safe practice. I think we can reduce the risks and maximize the benefit, but we could do some basic screening that could address and identify people who may be at greater risk of abuse of power, because you are, again, more vulnerable in this position. And that goes for both people. more vulnerable in terms of abuse of power, and more vulnerable to give up your own power to someone else. And we haven't yet figured out, at least in terms of a Western sense, of how best to support people responsibly. So, but I feel like we can. I feel like it's possible. And I think we just have to be willing to look both above and below ground and recreationally and everywhere in between, and be really honest and have open, honest conversations in community to work towards the solutions.
Thank you so much for talking about that and bringing up the sex work. I often have said it takes a very special kind of angel to do sex work. And that we do have people who are in that industry where touching is indicated, and perhaps genital touching. So are there therapies where genital touching is indicated, and can it be okay? And under what circumstances, or why not?
I'll jump in. So, well, first, I actually want to do two things. One, I want to just add a piece to what Dr. Sandra was saying. I love everything you said. One piece I wanted to point to was the how critical trust is in the dynamic, and the huge benefits that come with long-term relationship with working with somebody. I often don't see a client and initiate them into a medicine experience until I have seen them for 2 years. And that's so we've worked weekly for 2 years. I think at this point, I know you a lot more than if I would have started with one prep session. I'm a very anti 1 to 2 prep session person. I think you really need to develop a relationship. So just on that piece, before getting into this, yes, spicy question. Okay, so keyword is indicated in therapy. What I would say as a very pro sex work person as well, this is appropriate in that field. In if you are initiating a healing modality with a sex worker, like with somebody who that's their practice, awesome. That's not my practice. If there's somebody who is saying they're a psychedelic practitioner, that they're holding space for you, specifically in regards to the preparation and integration of a psychedelic experience, I do not think it's appropriate. I'm sure there's folks who will argue that there is like a combination between the two. I could see like a person who is, for example, a sex worker, awesome, and also works with psychedelics. That's not something that I have as easy of a time working with the ethics regarding, just because those lines are so blurred. I think psychotherapists and many folks who have been doing like underground work have a lot of experience in recognizing just the subtle vulnerabilities that happen in that state. So in my field, as a psychedelic psychotherapist, absolutely not. So I'd love to hear.
And maybe I'm tempted to steer away now, even though I do want to engage this honestly, mainly because I don't feel it's the dominance of the space. Mm-hmm. The dominant in terms of what people are going in for support in psychedelic therapy, treatment, and modalities isn't primarily sexual. and with that in mind, that the default position should be that's off limits. That any sort of and that in general touch should be default off limits, and that should be the assumption, not the other way around. And so that would be the danger of engaging this too much. But it's not because I don't think it's important, and I want to acknowledge and honor those who do that work with respect, because I hope eventually, we give our consent for a lot of things. We already give consent for sexual relationships. And I'm not saying we don't have problems with that. We have a rape culture. And I can't even talk about my periods without people being uncomfortable, let alone talking about, sexual, interests and desires and fantasies. Right. And I don't think that's, and that's not even getting into the rape culture piece, and how, there's discrimination, whether it be race, gender, LGBTQI+. And there's a lot of sensitivity and understanding that we are not given by default by our culture. And I'm speaking of Western culture, and that includes indigenous respect and wisdom keepers who have kept this for generations and thousands of years. And what hubris it is for us to assume that we are the ones who have the knowledge to be able to answer these questions. That said, I think we need to have a nod towards, I know a lot of people use the phrase harm reduction. I think this question comes up, but I like to focus on risk reduction and maximizing benefit. There's a concept in medical practice in the Hippocratic Oath, the idea of do no harm, and that being the strictest ethical boundary that is placed on all of us. That at the very least, like think about going to the doctor's office, at the very least, you shouldn't make me worse. You should at least not hurt me. And I think we still have a lot of growth area in just the do not harm area of psychedelic support and facilitation. And there's so much selling almost of psychedelic therapies and medicines as a cure-all, as it's going to be a miracle cure, and then you're going to just be better. You take, you give, whether you're talking about MDMA, ketamine, the mushroom, some people have come out of Michael Pollan's book, and I'm really grateful for both of his books on this. But a misunderstanding of some of the promise that it does offer and doesn't offer. It is not a quick fix for anything. And similarly, it's not going to be a quick fix in terms of how to best support these experiences. And I think we should be looking more towards indigenous wisdom and practices, and more to the people who've been doing the work in terms of not just that personal work in terms of looking within, but also those who've been doing the practice for generations.
Thank you. So there is a call in the open letter to the psychedelic community addressing abuse and repair to set up an independent ethics council for professionals. How can underground practitioners be held accountable?
I want this to be a question for how can all practitioners be held accountable. We're getting to like a complicated like split between the worlds in which practitioners are working. And the complicated piece here being that no matter what we create, this will still happen. There is no ethics board or a regulation or thing you can sign off that's going to automatically make you more ethical. It's like Dr. Sandra was saying, the experience of an internal ethics, like doing the work, going to your own therapy and acknowledging where your shadow is. Or if therapy isn't the place where you heal and do your shadow work, then you're doing absolutely anything else that is the work to engage with that. In general, though, I do see that we are looking towards just more regulation, just more organizations that kind of allow space for survivors to just have their voices present. Having conversations like these is really important too, that we're not just having conversations about psychedelics that are all about their beauty and expansiveness, but also about like the fact that this is really intense and wild and can get really scary, and extremely vulnerable. So yeah, that's what I'll say for now. We're working on it, and I just hope that we continue to have the conversation and right our wrongs.
I love that, Danielle. And I just love the idea of I know I'm the ethicist here, but I should be like, yay, ethics codes, yay, ethics councils. But actually, most people I've experienced in this space do have a sense of a code, do have a sense of accountability, are doing at least to some extent the work. And if that's true, then what's the challenge, right? And I think it's really trying to come together and have, just like Danielle was saying about having these conversations and continue them, and have it be not taboo to talk about any of these subjects, even though it can be triggering and it can be uncomfortable, to be able to hold that space for each other. Peers with peers, facilitators with facilitators, both in between, inter-communities, from Western scientists to Indigenous practitioner medicine keepers. It needs to literally take a village. It is going to be all of us. And if a practitioner is in isolation or a particular community is in isolation, I think that's when you're more likely to see abuses. And I don't think we can ultimately appeal to any certification, code of ethics, or board to relieve us of that individual accountability and that community accountability. That we really need to think more broadly than what, at least for me, my Western tradition has taught me about how that works. The law in and of itself is not necessarily ethical, as we all know. And we're never relieved of that responsibility towards ourselves, towards the people in our lives, and towards our communities. And I think we need to think more broadly. I think we need to really, learn from, I know you're hearing a broken record about me uplifting Indigenous voices, and I can't speak for any of them. And there's multiple ones and multiple perspectives. And yes, some of them are patriarchal, and you wouldn't want to have their system too, right? but at least if we start opening those conversations and start engaging with them, we have the possibility of building a stronger community across the board. That real diversity, real equity, real justice and inclusion isn't coming to an agreement. It's allowing the disagreement and respect and supporting one another through it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that answer. And I have a question from the audience. So we're being asked, what's the #1 thing you think is missing in underground psychedelic practices? So guides, sitters, integration coaches. What's missing?
Okay, this is similar to the last question where it was like, we can't do a thing where we split the like tiers or the puddles of who's providing these services, because if we do that, then we may generalize the experience of a group of people that may not be particularly true for the individuals. I say that because there are folks who are above ground, many boards of licenses, many degrees, a lot of work in the community, who still harm, like our most recent accounts, right? And then we have underground practitioners who maybe aren't therapists by trade, but also harm. And then we have folks in the community who are offering different forms of services. We have ceremonial practices where harm also occurs. So I don't want to do the thing where I like diss the underground, right? Because we get enough of that. We get enough of the community, the psychedelic community fighting over what's right and who's right. There's going to be a person for everybody. That's it. It's just an individual, like it's the practice of shopping for a practitioner, and maybe depending on your multiple identities, somebody above ground works better for you, maybe somebody below ground works better for you, and that can be really complicated and really difficult. I could do one quick thing to give an example. Before I worked in the above ground, I was working in the underground, but then I recognized that as an Indigenous woman of color, maybe I should probably do something where I was backed up by the law. Right. So there was just kind of a thing there where I'm like, oh, this is riskier for me because of my identities. And also I would want like some ethics, some board protecting every choice that I make, some basically like a holy book of how I turn towards this work. I also wanted the experience of loads of knowledge of depth psychology to really understand the interactions of a human and everything that happens internally. And also that may be too much for some people, right? So I don't know if I necessarily want to answer in a way that's going to like increase the split. Does that make sense? Yeah.
That
Yeah.
makes perfect sense. Yes, and we do want to bring people together
Mhm.
rather than creating a rift or a bigger rift. So, Dr. Sandra, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, and thank you, Danielle, for your response. And I deeply appreciate your intersectionality in this space and Paul Mark's as well, and my own. And I appreciate that we have a sort of a diverse representation here, at least, at least at some point. I know we can't be perfectly diverse, but I want to add, yeah, similar to what you want to say. I don't want to, most of this work is, not legal,
Mhm.
right? And most people who've experienced psychedelics have experienced it in what would be called "quote unquote" underground. I mean, underground has this sort of like shady edge to it, like it's like, some people are doing it in a dark alley or something like that. But most of the people I know, that's not where they're doing it. And this is just to say that the same thing that affects people who are doing it "quote unquote" underground, the same thing that's affecting people above ground. I think it's the fact that it is not able to be done. It's not decriminalized predominantly. I happen to be fortunate that Santa Cruz is a decriminalized area. And I know other areas of California are, Oakland up closer to where Danielle is, and Arcata and some other places, and more areas are becoming decriminalized. But the same pressure that makes people not want to share abuses and stories and fear of getting caught, that sort of idea, or especially if you're BIPOC, that pressure is even more significant, not less. And even if you're part of like a clinical trial with MAPS, right, there's pressure to not disclose any sort of issues that were to arise because, oh, you're going to hurt the movement. Oh, and I know there have been explicit stories of people being told not to share their experiences of actual abuse because of fear of hurting the movement, quote unquote. And that's not okay. And you could blame the war on drugs. You can, a Western sort of mindset of forbiddenness and taboo, and a disenfranchisement, not just with ourselves and our nature and with plant medicines, but also with, I don't want to go into trying to get an origin story, but the fact is that there's a larger problem that's a cause of these abuses and other issues not coming to the surface. On top of that, to go back to something Kalia brought up in the Chacuna conversation, is what about the application and the experiential training? I think one of the strengths of the quote unquote underground community is they have more experience and more applied actual knowledge that the above ground does not. They have a lot more theory. They're organizing and structuring from a Western or scientific mindset, but that doesn't have the same sort of skills in practice that or having that supervision that can happen by, like, you think about a therapist and how many therapist hours they have to have in order to be approved to work with clients. That sort of orientation towards experiential learning and psychedelic therapy and treatment hasn't yet fully gotten there yet. And there's a lot of diversity in the space and what counts as education for above ground, because you think about what's happening in Oregon as things get approved and what counts as a certification, who decides who is qualified and to what degree and what level. Personally, even though I definitely want to hold space for therapists, I want to hold space for everyone. If Shabibo or a curandero cannot practice, that would be wrong in my mind, ethically speaking, and they would be considered underground, which I think is horrifying to me to an extent. So in that sense, I think we have more to learn from the quote unquote underground than currently is available to the people above ground. But I think it's both directions. We both have things to learn from each other, and this brings me back to the community idea again, that we need to be more open and appreciate where our strengths and where our weaknesses are, and be willing to have the humility to learn from each other and recognize that.
Thank you so much. And we've opened up a little bit. We talked a little bit around it, but can we hear a little bit about the difference between legalization and decriminalization of drugs or of substances?
Hmm. This is probably more of a Dr. Sandra one. My quick thing I say is decriminalization is loosening of criminal penalties. Like it's the experience of like looking the other way. Legalization is like lifting or abolishing laws that of possession and sorry, may sneeze, possession or personal use, recreational use. So they're different. They're totally different. And that results in different experiences for folks who are using, or the sense of being free. Different implications of what happens in use, both in underground and above ground. So yeah, lots to talk about there. I'd love to hear Dr. Sandra speak to this part as an ethicist. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but, I'm just teasing a little bit. But thank you. I appreciate that, Danielle. And I would agree. But I think you're exactly right. Like decriminalization doesn't change the legal status. It removes, depending upon how it's implemented. I know when I first got familiar with decriminalization, it was when I was doing needle exchange that was decriminalized in California before it became legal in California. And it was considered sort of a gray area, and the police knew where we were, but in the Santa Cruz Health, I mean, not the Santa Clara actually, county would come every other week, and they knew we were there too, but technically they weren't the ones giving out the needles in exchange, right? But it was technically not legal, right? Similarly, in like Santa Cruz where I am, decriminalization means personal use and personal possession will not be prioritized. It's sort of by the city. So Lily, in the city of Santa Cruz, it is the lowest priority of the police. It doesn't mean that you can't be arrested for it. Mm-hmm. Because it hasn't become legal. The federal standard, and actually right now, SB 519 in California which has been approved by the Senate and is now up for to be considered by the Assembly, is going to try and pursue decriminalization for the state, versus Oregon, which is trying to have permissible through the state. Now, none of this changes the federal scheduling of these substances, right? Even marijuana, which a lot of people have pushed towards decriminalization versus legalization because of what we've learned from what happened with the legalization of marijuana, of how corporations literally came in and took over sort of smaller businesses, and people who've been holding the space for cannabis use and medicines for a long time were then ousted through corporate use. And I'm not necessarily saying I'm against corporations, but I know that's part of the cautionary tale that was learned, and that part of the push towards decriminalization first versus going straight to legalization, in my opinion. That said, marijuana is still a Schedule 1, I think, a substance. And in order to be on a Schedule 1, and MDMA is on there, as well as psilocybin and and LSD, and these other substances like MDMA and psilocybin have both been marked by the FDA as breakthrough therapies due to the research that are now in clinical trials phase 3 for both MDMA and psilocybin, expected to be approved in February 2023, approximately, for both. Right. So despite what the research is showing, which for Schedule 1, you need to both show that it's going to cause harm and there's no medical use. And we know for pretty much all the substances, I would definitely argue that there is in fact medical use and therapeutic use. And for marijuana, cannabis, we definitely know that that's the case. And yet it's still a Schedule 1 substance, federally speaking. So there is a distinct difference between decriminalization and legalization. I think we should be supporting more decriminalization efforts across the board. And you should investigate that in your area, city, county, state, country, depending upon where you're at. And there's legal plant medicines too that that are also getting in danger of being placed on Schedule 1 or being banned internationally, such as kratom, which I've been an advocate for. That, you know, the FDA was trying to make it a Schedule 1 substance, but wasn't able to prove it. That it was a harm, and that it didn't have therapeutic use, and then they tried to make it illegal internationally through the World Health Organization. But this just to say we need to appreciate this difference and to be good advocates for all plant medicines, scheduled or unscheduled.
Did you have something to say, Danielle?
I was just going to be really radical and say all drugs. I do that with so in civilization efforts, there's the conversation surrounding plants, like yes to nature, like decrim nature, which I think is obviously super awesome. But also, we need to end the war on drugs, and we should be decriminalizing and legalizing eventually all drugs, which is a very radical Dr. Carl Hart specific opinion.
That's what I was going to say.
Right. That's definitely where this idea is from, and I fully agree. I think a lot of our like psychedelic exceptionalism comes into these conversations sometimes, and I think totally, like, let's start with this. Let's totally start with the medicines that are a little bit more digestible, right? And then we can get to the fact that, yes, guess what? People also have like incredible, profound spiritual healing experiences on meth. They just don't have the containers, or absent of stigma, or guides, or that psychedelics and entheogens get. So that's, again, super radical, and I'd love to talk about it more, but it also brings up a lot of people's internalized feelings over these not as good drugs. So that was my just one little follow-up, and I super agree and appreciate everything you said, Sandra.
That's interesting. I've always said, as long as there is a safe and legal option, let's do it, you know? So let's give people their, you know, this is the land of opportunity. So let's definitely help people find safe and legal options for all the things that they wish to experience. So the next question.
Before you do, I know I'm going to do an extra chime, but it's like,
go ahead.
Thank you. Well, part of it's like, let's look at the harms that are actually caused by making these substances illegal and being placed on scheduled substances, right? I mean, we can't safely test them. We can't create safe spaces in the sense of being able to have access, and like the fentanyl contamination is very real. That's causing the overdoses, and you know, the amount of deaths that are caused now. It's epidemic proportions, and in some weeks you can look at the numbers, and there are more overdose deaths than COVID deaths. And I'm not saying that that's this week, but I'm just saying, you know, we need to get more serious about that. Like, why aren't we talking about fentanyl? Why aren't we creating a safe supply? Knowing that that these are substances that are being used, we're not stopping the use of these substances. The war on drugs is definitely a clear failure, and had political motivations, and not going into that. But I just want to acknowledge, like, I love that, for instance, World Psychedelics Day, the organization hosted in Canada, there's actually ways to actually safely test your medicines in Canada. In the United States, you know, there are some kits like Bunk Kit and Dance Safe provide kits. Hopefully someone can put in the links for us there. I would highly encourage anyone using any substances to test, especially if it is, whether it's heroin, cocaine, MDMA, there is contamination, and it's because fentanyl's cheap and easy to manufacture. And I just want to, you know, so we're talking about providing for safer spaces and supporting psychedelics and plant medicines. Please, you know, take that extra time to test and to find those resources. And things like test kits are often illegal. You know, it's like that, at the very least, we should make those accessible, which it seems really basic to me, in terms of if we really are serious about reducing risk and maximizing benefits. we could make it more accessible.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm gonna do the thing because I just have to. Is it because Sandra, what you're saying is just is gold, because you're speaking to the reality that our society and culture hates drug users, right? So if we have our testing kits are not accessible, then it's pretty much an indicator that we don't really care what happens to the drug user, because our heart says it's a moral failure that they are deciding to be as deviant as to enjoy drugs, right? And so just, it just instantly broke my heart, and speaking to that. So yeah, lots of stigma that we're trying to like completely combat now. Paul, Mark, you can totally ask your questions.
Thank you for moderating me. So, a follow-up to that is, if psychedelics were decriminalized, would we see more accountability? Or if they were legalized? And is one preferred over the other in terms of preventing abuse?
The first thing that comes up for me with this one is honestly the image I just first get is Black and brown bodies, and how decriminalization or legalization, you're still going to get like messed with by those in positions of power and in law enforcement. So it's tricky. The hope is that as we decriminalize and move towards legalization, there will be just more regulation. When Dr. Sandra was speaking, I was thinking of like Starbucks, because Starbucks is a place where you can see, oh, look at all of this regulation that's happening over this drug, caffeine, right? And it's sourced ethically, safely, right? That it's now people can access it. The exchange is harmless, right? So to speak. But what if we were to see something? Can we imagine a world where that's happening with other drugs, right? Just playing with that. Hard question. If one is preferred over the other in terms of preventing abuse. Again, pointing towards legalize all drugs if safe, if possible, with time.
And right now, I think I'm leaning towards decriminalization first. That's my short answer for once.
Wow, okay, thank you. So it does seem like legalization through medicalization is in the cards. Will this medical and highly monetized model potentially reproduce the inequalities that we see in the current healthcare system? What about access for low income and Black and brown bodies, people of color?
Like absolutely. This is like so the inequalities are systemic to the colonial culture in which we live. We are on a land that is ripe with genocide, and capitalism that ultimately is designed to really not, I don't want to say really harsh words, but really not support the livelihood of Black and brown bodies, low income bodies. So just considering that, like if we do anything, the inequalities are going to stay there, because that's just a function in which we exist, right? So there's my short answer for that one.
I don't think I have a short answer for this one. Sorry, not sorry. No, but well, first of all, I just want to mention and thank you, Danielle. And I think those are all really important ideas and concepts. And one thing I want to bring up is just the idea that it shouldn't be, in my opinion, strictly a medical option. That these psychedelic and plant medicines have multiple uses, and it's not just for medical therapeutic uses. And I think that all uses and intentions should be open to possibilities with, respect to autonomy and consenting adults and all the sort of wonderful things. I know one of the concerns with medicalization is access. And right now, you could argue that access is actually more prohibitive than it would be if it was decriminalized, that there's more risk to Black and brown bodies and Indigenous peoples, people who have, you know, not have economic access or through education or whatever is the barrier for entry, because of the fact that it is illegal, because we're not able to have these open, honest conversations and support the access and think about it differently. I know, like if you were to do a sort of one-on-one journey with someone for like a, you know, in a sort of, I would say more responsible way over like a few days, you know, where you do setup and then journey and then integration, you're liable to spend $1,000 for a qualified guide, as an example, right? That's not accessible. Going to a ketamine clinic, which is legal right now in the United States, that is not currently accessible. Even if you were to do sort of an online sort of accessing form, it's still like $900, which versus getting ketamine on the street, as it were, you can get a lot cheaper, but without those supports, right? It doesn't become as therapeutic as supported. And I know a lot of people do group guiding work in part so that we can have it be more accessible. And that may be something that I think at least the therapeutic model needs to look more seriously at. And I know there is some thought towards that. There isn't too much research on that yet, but I think that's an area that we're going to need to more consciously explore if we want to really make this accessible. That I do not feel that the medical model currently is accessible, and it's not just healthcare. I think it's also a question of, you know, having appropriate support, and I think working in community can actually really create these sort of more supportive journeys still and make it more equitable, accessible. And actually, I feel, you know, depending upon what your needs are, can actually be more healing than even a one-on-one journey experience. And I think we need the diversity of the space for options on what people would want in the end. You know, whether, for instance, one of the challenges for people of color is simply the fact that there are not enough therapists who are of color in the space to be able to get that support from. And if you're dealing with a problem with like racialized trauma, you know, that's not a problem that's necessarily going away. And I say that only out of respect to the fact that that racism is an enduring social issue currently. And that if you're in a sort of like a white, like let's say I was the white therapist, because, you know, I'm a privileged white girl, colonialist descendant, the whole 9 yards. And if I'm giving that, it's not going to be the same experience than if it came from someone who was a Black or brown body or Indigenous, and you have a different perspective that I can never achieve, right? And I think we need to be bringing more people into the space, whether they be therapists or facilitators or others, in order to really create that. So not just in terms of whether it's medical or non-medical or individual or group, but really raise up people who already are in inequitable situations, already are being discriminated against, whether it be feminine, masculine, LGBTQIA+, neurodiverse, and others, that there has to be a very intentional bringing of those people and voices up into the community to be able to really start having true diversity and equity in the space.
Thank you for saying that. And it's important that even with our three faces here, there are going to be people who want to hear your voice, Dr. Sandra, or Danielle, or my voice. And there may be different things, you know, different potential harms from me sitting for a particular type of person versus one of you. And so the person, the facilitator, is just as an important choice as anyone else. You know, we want to know, you know, are you triggered, or, you know, do you have some emotions around seeing a person with green hair, or a blonde, or a woman, or a man, or someone who is transgendered? You know, there's all of those things. that have to be considered, and we need to have facilitators that meet all of those things, because some people are going to look up, just like what happened in television. You look up and you're like, I don't see me. But now we see other people who are seeing themselves, and it's very important. And so you need to have a connection to someone.
Absolutely.
So we're going to go back to these days. We are actually seeing a lot of discussion at psychedelic events around issues of indigenous reciprocity, and even some of the big publicly traded psychedelic pharmaceutical companies are discussing this. How do we make sure this is more than lip service?
Maybe I could tie these two little things together, because I put in the chat, just to add and kind of to follow up with you, Paul Mark, this experience of as a practitioner, one practitioner is going to be right for somebody and not right for another person, and our multifaceted identities are where access begins, right? So nearly all of my clients at this point, I think save for like 2, are BIPOC, and that is and queer, specifically because they needed to make sure they met with a psychotherapist who's very drug positive, and also a person of color, and also knows the queer experience. So just that alone is access. I just wanted to pin that there are some organizations like Sage Institute and Sauna Healing Collective who are offering low fee sliding scale psychedelic psychotherapy. And another part of access in this is being able to see a psychotherapist who will talk to you about how to safely use your street drugs, right? So maybe you can't access something like this $900 ketamine treatment. Maybe you can't even access the $30 ketamine treatment that I have literally offered before. But maybe you can get street ketamine, and you can work with your therapist to find a way to make sure it's tested, and you can plan for preparation and use. To answer the question on indigenous reciprocity, I really like to talk about decolonizing psychedelic psychotherapy. I think we want to make sure to use the word decolonizing when we are actually ready to say that that's what we're doing, where there is true reciprocity happening upon the land. And if we're not actually doing that work, if it is just lip service, if all we're doing is including it in academia, talking about it, then we're not actually doing it. And in that case, you could say something like decentering. But if you are doing the work of decolonizing psychedelic therapy, and if you actually are like meeting the goals of indigenous reciprocity, then you are literally returning the land. So if you've met an indigenous person to Turtle Island, you've probably heard the words land back. That's a big part of this, is like literally giving back the land. For these large scale pharmaceutical companies, if they can do that with any of their power, that's pretty much one of the best things you could do. Other than that, you make a lot of money. Hand it over. Most of the folks, most indigenous folks do not have generational wealth. So really returning back, thinking of these, even the therapists who are making pretty good money off of psychedelic therapy, like what ways can you till the soil? On my land, we have an organization called Sogarayate Land Trust. And I highly recommend that every single practitioner who provides healing space on this land to pay their dues to the people who till the soil here. There are similar organizations on land that you are living on that is indigenous that can be given back to. Or thinking about the healers, Masatek Shabibo, for example, folks who are bringing this lineage of work, how can you return back to them? Like, how do they need to be supported, since their wisdom is how we've grown this field? Lots of good stuff to say there, and looking forward to talking to you all more. I am just going to note that I am going to have to pop off very soon because I have a client at 5 p.m. and I have to get into therapist mode. So, but I'll pop off in a sec.
Well, thank you so much, Danielle, and it's been a joy to have you here in this conversation. And Dr. Sandra, did you have a quick little thing to add?
I just want to honor and respect Danielle's answer first and foremost, and also acknowledge that I'm on Ohlone lands here in Santa Cruz County, and I definitely would respect all of what Danielle brought up. I would only add is to develop those relationships with intention. To find, like, both in terms of, like, where I am, that means for me, I would develop a relationship with the Ohlone, right? And if I use like the mushroom, then I should, acknowledge, the medicine keepers who've held that tradition, for instance, the Mazatec and the Zapotec, right? And that sense of real reciprocity to me is actually not just a sort of a Western notion of exchange, of equal exchange, which is very, Western colonial idea and concept of reciprocity, versus we are all in relationship. To me, it's a more spiritual notion that we are interconnected, that we cannot be in a space where we're not in relationship, whether it be with the land, the nature, with the history of the place, our ancestors, with the peoples who were there before us, and all the knowledge that we are benefiting from, all of us are benefiting from by this conversation alone, the amount of people and energies and efforts who we cannot cite in a list of references. The indigenous voices are oral, primarily traditions, and they don't have a voice simply because of the fact that their voice isn't written down, and that's what Western concepts recognize. And some of that reciprocity is recognizing the harms we've caused. And not just in terms of land, but for instance, in the Amazon, the oil extraction and other ways we've treated indigenous peoples. So for me, reciprocity is acknowledging that in a relationship of community and working with them and asking them what do they need in relationship, just like you would a friend.
Thank you. What an amazing discussion. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So I want to thank you so much. I want to say thank you to the speakers who have taken time out of their busy schedules to take a look at these important topics in the wonderful world of psychedelics. And thank you everyone who has contributed to make this happen. Thank you to our crew behind the scenes. And thank you to those of you who have listened in and added to the chat. Thank you all. And please check out WPD620.org for some really cool merchandise and for replays of the 2021, and get involved in the 2022 calendar. So please let us know if you have anything that's coming up. We do encourage you to go ahead and do those things on 6/20 next year, but definitely let us know what you have coming up in your calendar. We want to add it as a resource on the site. Happy winter solstice, everyone. And until we meet again, safe journeys.